Hey everybody, welcome to our virtual forum on fair districts, fair elections. Basically what we're looking at is gerrymandering in Ohio. We're so fortunate to be joined by some amazing and accomplished panelists that'll walk us through all the different stories and ideas about redistricting reform, give you some good information. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start walking us through, who's here, who we're going to talk with, and then I'm going to give you a little bit of information so you have an agenda for the day. And so I'm Kathay Turcer with Common Cause Ohio, and I just once again really want to welcome you to Gerrymandering and Ohio. This is our virtual forum. We have some amazing panelists who are incredibly accomplished. The first person I wanted to identify was Michael Lee from the Brennan Center for Justice. Now you'll notice here, you're going to see his Twitter handle right here. Now this is especially important for Michael, because if you are a Twitterer, it is well worth following him. The reason I say this is, there was a little time, just a few days ago, I was a little down, and Michael had this tweet that basically said, well, bless his heart. Maybe he doesn't understand how vote by mail works, which one would not necessarily have thought to put bless your heart with a tweet that was so incendiary about vote by mail. So well worth following him on Twitter. You'll also notice there's a Brennan Center for Justice handle. I would definitely pay attention to that. Now, Kathay Feng is here as well. She is well worth following. She does some really interesting, what I would think of as those kind of Facebook live streaming events that focused on redistricting and gerrymandering all over the country. And so if you're kind of interested, well, what's going on with Missouri? What's happening in Oregon? What are the different options? She is well worth following. And of course, I do encourage us all to follow Common Cause. And then here is Jen Miller, who's also with us, and the League of Women Voters has a ton of different information. So your hashtags for today: fair maps, gerrymandering, and end gerrymandering. So I would encourage all of us, if you're tweeting away, to use those hashtags. And so this is me. I'm at Kathay Turcer. One of the things I'm going to encourage you all to do is to put questions into the Q&A section. So you'll notice there's like a comment section. Now in the comment section, what I'm hoping that you're going to do is put in information about where you're from so that we can see, where you're from. I'm Catherine from Dublin, Ohio. And I wanted to welcome you all here. But I'd encourage you to say, where you're from and give us a little bit of information, because it's great to have an idea of who's participating. I wanted to thank all the people that gave us questions before we started. So we're going to be using some of those questions, and then I'm going to be adding to them. So as we go, please put your questions in the Q&A so that we can ask questions of our panelists at the very end. And on that note, I would like to show you these two wonderful pictures, and you're going to see, they're going to be on camera as well. So here we have Michael Lee. What's interesting about him is he comes from Texas. He is the senior counsel for the Brennan Center for Justice's democracy program, and we're really blessed to have him with us today to give us some insight into the redistricting and the challenges with redistricting and the lawsuits and all of the different things that make up the whole world of redistricting. What he's going to really focus on is the census and how it will impact redistricting. He has a JD from Tulane, and this is interesting. He was the executive director of B1 Texas. So he has a little bit of grassroots energy going on there. The other person that you're going to see here is Kathay Feng. Now, the thing that's amazing about Kathay is when we redistricting reformers, we're working on redistricting reform in 2005. Any of you remember Reform Ohio Now? And we got our butts kicked? Well, Kathay was getting her butt kicked in California at exactly the same time. One of the things that we all know is the story of redistricting reform is the story of perseverance and keeping at it and really just pushing on. Now, one of the things we know is that California managed to pass first state legislative redistricting reform, then congressional redistricting reform, which is exactly the order that we did it. Now, the thing that Kathay managed to do is she managed to do it before the 2011 map making. And so we're hoping to learn from her experience of taking the reforms that she imagined and the people of California imagined and that folks like Arnold Schwarzenegger worked on, and then thought, how did they implement that? And what did that actually look like? So Kathay went to UCLA Law School. She was the executive director of Common Cause California, and she is now the national redistricting director for Common Cause. And so Kathay, we're so glad you're joining us. So then we also have Jen Miller, the hometown girl. So Jen grew up in Ohio. She actually grew up in a rural area of Ohio near Mansfield. She is the executive director of the League of Women Voters. Before that, she was the executive director of the Sierra Club. She has a master's from John Glenn School of Public Affairs at Ohio State, and she's a jazz singer. We also know her from her wonderful videos with her dogs and her cats that are focused on voting, and so we're so pleased that Jen will be with us here today too. You notice I'm getting the hang of moving this thing along. Technology is a beautiful thing. Okay, so this is what we're going to do. We're going to talk about Ohio's gerrymandering and redistricting reform history. Then we're going to talk a little bit about what can we do to get ready for 2021. Then we're going to focus on the census and the impact on the map making. And then we're going to look at some other states and implementation. And then finally, we're going to get to some questions. We're going to focus on public engagement, holding the map makers accountable, the census delay, and then other questions that pop up as we move along. And I hope you're putting those questions into the Q&A section because we have two folks that are paying attention to those. So there's Michael Barron with the League of Women Voters of Greater Cleveland, and then Mia Lewis, who's with me from Common Cause. And with that, I'm actually going to hand this over to you, Jen, and you just let me know when you want a slide to advance.
All right, well, let's start at the first slide. Thank you, Catherine. And I will warn you that my dog Marley does like to be vocal, especially when I am talking. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. I just wanted to remind everyone that history in terms of how far we have come, because on this, in terms of participants right now, so many of you are redistricting champions, your fair districts champions. And so just a little reminder about that perseverance and why we still need to persevere, something to be inspiring about. And you can hang right there. I think that's great. You know, we started from 1978 to 2001, the League of Women Voters had worked with legislators to introduce legislation to stop gerrymandering in Ohio, with no success. And then in 1999, 2005, and 2012, we of course failed at the ballot box, finally winning in 2015 with 71.5% of the vote in all 88 counties. And then in 2018 for congressional districts for 74, almost 75% of voters. And that's all because of you. And I think a lot of you probably remember what happened between 2012 and that win in 2015 was that we started educating the public about gerrymandering so that they understood it. I think the public generally has a sense as to not feeling represented and that maybe their congressperson or their state rep isn't really hearing them, but we were able to really start to tell that story of gerrymandering in a way that empower the public. So we're gonna go and look at a couple slides. So let's go back to that last one. You know, we think about Ohio's got some amazingly terrible terrible districts. So we have the Snake on the Lake was the first one, and never before had half of Toledo been connected with half of Cleveland, right? And just the fact that actually you have to leave Marcy Kaptur's district to actually travel it or go through the water. It is such a wonky and weird district, this Snake on the Lake. And I think when we look at this, we can just instinctively know, and this isn't always the case with maps, but this is an example of a district where we can instinctively know that you wouldn't just naturally come up with a district that looks like this. This was done on purpose for partisan efforts. And now we'll go to the next one, which was the Franklin County sinkhole. So, you know, they decided that the map makers, the majority, decided they wanted to have this big city of Columbus and they were going to have 3 congressional districts. They wanted to guarantee that only one would be Democratic. And so all of this intricate cutting out of various areas in that red, all those weird twists and turns, all that is about sinking as many Democrats into that blue area. So really packing the one district with so many Democrats, and then splitting in all those funky little areas, splitting the Democrats and cracking them, you can say. So let's go to the next slide. So one of the things that we've done, and it's been really interesting, that a lot of the records requests that Catherine and Ann Hankener and friends did during the 2011 map making, then was done, there was even more records requests done actually during our gerrymandering trial with A. Philip Randolph Institute and ACLU Ohio, this is talking about that Franklin County sinkhole, where Tom Hoffeller is a national guy who really had a lot to do with the citizenship question on the census that is no longer there. But he was calling parts of Grandview and parts of downtown dog meat voting territory. Basically this idea that those Democrats, it was leaning too progressive. And so that was dog meat voting territory. And that was part of how they were, again, taking various populations and trying to sink them, you know, into, you know, pack them into Joyce Beatty's district. And the bottom line for us at League is not that we are trying to have a map that favors Democrats or Republicans, but actually just that we have maps that are fair and therefore can be responsive to the people. And when map makers are using terms like dog meat territory, then we know that they're not really concerned about the people, right? Because making maps should be something that really is about preserving our democracy and holding up a system where our representatives do represent us. When politicians are guaranteed their outcome because of partisan gerrymandering, they're guaranteed to have their seat, they don't have to listen to their voters, whether it's voting policy or climate change or clean water or education funding. And so that's really the problem for us about gerrymandering and why the League has fought it. We fought it when Democrats were the creators of gerrymandered maps, and we fight it now that Republicans are the creators of gerrymandered maps, because no voter and no voter territory in Ohio is dog meat. So let's talk about this. Their plan, and they said this explicitly in their emails, actually. Their plan all along was to create a congressional map that would consistently, no matter what, no matter changes in voter preference, no matter changes in voter turnout, that it would be guaranteed to be a 12-4 map, 12 Republicans, 4 Democrats. And in fact, in the emails we saw, they were talking about a 13-3 map and decided that that was too much. So here you see what is happening here in terms of the statewide vote share versus the seat share. And we're not saying that every district should look exactly like the statewide vote share. And we're also not saying that that all the districts combined would look exactly like the statewide vote share, but they should be more aligned. They should be more movable. And we should see more parity when we are so close in elections like 2012, we should see more parity in how many seats Republicans versus Democrats have. All right, I think I'm almost done because really the superstars are coming up. I don't want to take too much time. And then I think we have the question of what all of you can do. And I hope, I know right now it feels like we can be, oh, actually we'll talk about this. The 2015 state legislative redistricting reforms that we all worked to get on the ballot and pass has a commission of governor, auditor, secretary of state, and then 4 lawmakers. And I think what's really important to know about this is that you have to have at least 2 of the minority parties sign off to get a 10-year map. So there is an encouragement of bipartisanship. I also want to point out that both of these plans have public participation and transparency in there, because at the heart of Common Cause's work and League's work is about transparency in government and making sure that everyday Ohioans get to participate in such critical processes. But of course, we're working on keeping communities together, so not having those crazy jagged lines. And then, of course, the 2018 congressional redistricting reforms, like who could say no to that face? Of course, everyone should vote yes on issue 1 when you got a cutie pie like that. But this is why we do our work, right? Like, I love that we have, thank you for that picture. Our congressional redistricting reform is really focused on, again, reining in those worst offenses. There is more transparency. There is more public participation. It's a more complicated system for sure. And so we may get into that later. But I don't want to take up too much time from our experts. I think I might just have one more slide, Miss Catherine. We will see.
Now it's time for how do we demand fair maps, also with Miller.
Yeah, so thank you. So that's the last thing I was going to say. Clearly, we had to persist to get to the point where we are, where we actually have reforms, tools for us to use. And so let's keep in mind that, and these are the deadlines in the Ohio Constitution. I know we're going to talk about the census, but September 1 is the final deadline for the state districts, state level districts. Oh, wait, let's go back. I don't know what's happening with this thing. And then, but those are good looking pictures too. And then November 30th is the final deadline for the congressional districts. Of course, they're based on the census, and we're going to talk about that. But the bottom line is this: it's a short period of time, and so we have a lot that we need to do in between now and then. So things that you can do today is you can ask your lawmakers or candidates running for office where they stand on gerrymandering and ask them to pledge to end gerrymandering. You can write your letters to the editor. You can volunteer to be part of our various parts of the team. You know, you can sign up your friends and family. We will have our map making contest again, which I'm so excited about, which means that you can submit your own maps to be considered and adopted. That's really important because we want to show the General Assembly that folks actually understand how maps could be made, right? And we could have some really great ideas that come out of there. You also, if submitting an entire map seems like it's just too much, you could think of just creating your own district. And that might be a fun project, especially for a book club or a Boy Scout troop or a Girl Scout troop or things like that. So at that, I just want to say it's an honor to be here with all of you, the rock stars who are speaking and lots of rock stars who are listening in. Together, we can have fair maps in Ohio. Thank you.
Well, Jim, thank you so much. I really appreciated that good overview. You know, for many of us redistricting reformers that are on this, this is the tale of a lot of hard work. We saw a problem, we set our mind to actually creating fair maps, and we have actually changed the quality of democracy for years to come. But of course, now the hard work really starts. And so to give us an understanding of what's going on with the census, I'm actually going to hand this over to Michael Lee from the Brennan Center for Justice. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me, and I'm glad to be joining you from Brooklyn, New York. I wish I was able to fly out to Ohio and be with you in person, but we're all learning how to do this, and I think this will work well. The only thing that Catherine can't probably do is like give me the hook if I'm over time or something like that, but she'll wave like really vigorously, I'm sure. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some changes that are really important in the census and how that will impact redistricting. Because in a normal year, and hopefully everyone here has already filled out the census online or gotten the paper forms and filled those out. But in a normal year, hundreds of thousands of census workers would already be in the field knocking on doors of people who hadn't responded to the census. But because of the COVID-19 epidemic, the Census Bureau put a pause on that for good reason. They didn't want to endanger the health of those hundreds of thousands of people knocking on doors or the people that they were talking to. And so field operations that normally would have gotten started in March are now delayed until June. Some states have started a little earlier, but in most of the country, field operations have been delayed by 3 months until June. And what that has done is that's created a ripple effect throughout for the other deadlines. So normally in a normal year, that process of knocking on doors and following up with people would be complete by the end of July. That will now be not until the end of October. And then in a normal year, the Census Bureau would deliver the apportionment counts to the president in mid to late December, telling every state how many congressional seats they have and giving a total population count. Normally that would be a big presentation at the National Press Club in Washington. And then states would get their redistricting data starting in mid-February and ending, the statutory deadline is the end of March 2021. Every state would have the data that they need to do redistricting, and it would be off to the races. And in a normal cycle, states would be done with redistricting about, in most places, the summer or the fall, right? And so almost every state would be done. But because of the delays in starting knocking on the doors, the Census Bureau now will not be able to finish the collection of data until the end of October. And so the Bureau has asked Congress to extend the statutory deadlines, both for delivering the apportionment counts to the president, and then more importantly, in delivering the block level data that you need to draw maps to the states. The apportionment counts now will not be delivered until April 30th, 2021. And the redistricting data that states need to draw maps will not be delivered until July 31st, 2021. That in turn has created a significant ripple effect for the states, because the one thing that states have gotten used to is the census occurring exactly as it's occurred for the last 50 years. In other words, the data will always be delivered in mid-February to March. And so states have written, in many cases, language into their constitutions that are based on that. In other places, they have other more ambiguous language, but the whole of the redistricting process is built on the assumption that it will take place at exactly the same time as though it were sort of like Christmas or the rising or the setting of the sun. And now we're essentially finding out that, Christmas is delayed by 4 months, right? And so we have to figure out how to live with that. So Catherine, if you could advance to the next slide. So this is creating significant redistricting impacts around the country. Catherine, can you advance to the next slide? No, perfect. So, it's the biggest impacts are in Virginia, New Jersey, hold legislative elections in November of 2021. And it's going to be really hard for them if they don't get the data until the summer of 2021 to hold maps and to have a primary and, have a candidate filing period, have a primary, then have a general election. And those states are, and, they're going to have to figure out what to do, and they're in really a hard place. But redistricting in every state, virtually every state, with a few exceptions, will be impacted. The changes that need to be made range from special sessions to having to adjust statutory or constitutional deadlines, which are oftentimes set in stone. They'll say, do this by June 1st or do this by September 1st. And that creates a real barrier. But the one thing that is important to understand is that despite these delays, states, with the possible exception of Virginia and New Jersey, will have to redistrict in time for 2022, because the reality is once that data comes out, the states will know that the districts are malapportioned, that they will not have the same number of people, which is required by the Constitution. And so states will have a constitutional obligation to redistrict. If they don't, a court will step in and do it. And states many times have failed to redistrict. Minnesota didn't redistrict, Colorado didn't redistrict in 2011. And a number of other states, New York did not redistrict in 2011, and courts stepped in and drew maps. And so the good news is that there's a process in place for putting new maps in place. But states have an incentive for fixing this, and particularly in a state like Ohio, where you have these nice constitutional reforms that say people get to participate, they get to propose maps, they get to do all of this stuff, and that people are really excited about. The last thing you want is this process defaulting, and then just having a court say, "Oh, we're going to draw the map." So, Catherine, if you could advance to the next slide. Catherine, are you? It's slowly but surely, here we go. So, oh, it's much clearer now. I don't know what, so, okay, can you advance one more?
Are we on the correct one, Michael? Sorry about
anyway,
that.
I will, okay, so this is just an overview of how the states go, and there's a whole, you'll see there are a handful of states that redistricted in 2022, and they're, this is really complicated. The one thing that we found in doing an analysis of this is that state law is remarkably inconsistent. It wasn't designed for the idea that the census would be delayed. And, the one thing in Colorado, they very helpfully wrote into their constitutional amendment, fixed dates, but they said at the end, but the commission may adjust these dates if it's for reasons beyond the commission's control. And they're the only state that has that language. So in the future, we'll put it in everything else, because we, like everybody else, kind of assumed the census was the rising or the setting of the sun. But if you can go to the next slide, I'll talk about Ohio specifically, what happens in Ohio, because I know that's probably more interesting than what happens in Texas to people. So, Ohio is one of the states that has some pretty hard fixed dates in its state constitution. And some states say it's the legislative session after the publication of the census or something. But Ohio, the legislature, when they drafted the two reforms, did not. They put in really hard dates, which seemed really good and generous and reasonable at the time, but not if you're getting your data in July, because once you get the data, somebody process that data and put it into the precincts and blocks that you use actually to draw maps. And so that takes about 5 weeks. And then, so, you're not really getting started until sometime really around, potentially August, right? And so then you've got to draw maps really fast, and you've got to hold public hearings and got to get input. And so, as was alluded to earlier, the Commission for Legislative Maps has until September 1st to adopt plans for the General Assembly. The congressional process is a little bit more flexible, but it has 3 parts. The legislature has until September 30th to adopt a plan. If it doesn't, the process defaults to the commission, which has until October 31st to adopt a congressional plan. And then if that fails, the legislature has until November 30th to adopt a plan. And the outer limit is the candidate filing period, which the deadline is February 2nd, 2022 in Ohio. And that will create a number of issues. So what happens in Ohio, that's something that I think is going to be really important to work out, because those dates have to move, particularly the date for legislative plans, if you don't want that defaulting to a court. And so something is going to have to be done, an amendment to the Constitution, perhaps, which some states are considering on, sort of an emergency basis. There might also be executive action that the governor can take to sort of extend that. But that's something that I think is going to have to be looked at. The timing for the congressional maps is a little bit more flexible. It's possible that you could get it done by November 30th, but it would be hard in the sense that, to have all the hearings and everything like that. And that's going to be a real challenge. And one of the things that we think should happen is that you shouldn't sacrifice the hearings and the public participation, because that's key, right? That's key to policing the process. And the one thing that we don't want is legislatures moving these states just enough so that they have enough time to do it, but then not enough time for people to actually have insight into what is going on, and lawmakers basically, or use it to like ram through another gerrymander, right? Which Ohio suffered from all this decade. And so our one possibility is to sort of extend the date, but then also to move the primary back, or the candidate filing period back a little bit, just give enough time for that to happen. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Catherine, and I'm happy to answer questions at the end.
Well, now we're going to hear from Kathay Feng. Welcome, Kathay, and just let me know when you're ready to begin.
Yeah, sure. Go to the next slide. So my name is Kathay Feng, and I am with Common Cause. I used to head up California Common Cause, so I was sort of Catherine's counterpart in California. And in fact, actually in 2005, we did have simultaneous ballot initiatives going, and we didn't win either state, and we sort of had a lot of lessons learned. But I think what's really exciting is that since then, if we look across the nation, we've really seen a lot of states adopt some type of redistricting reform. So this map is actually of the entire country and the different kinds of commissions or some type of reform that a state has adopted. Now, of course, I'm just going to note that, like, even though some states are all colored the same, it doesn't mean that they have exactly the same kind of approach, but we try to figure out a way of grouping them. So there are 7 states that have what we call an independent commission. And what that basically means is that it's a commission that may have some politicians, may be citizens, but they ultimately are the ones who vote on the maps, and their vote is what passes and adopts the map that is going to end up being used by a state. Those are the states that are in blue. And as you can see, they're mostly Western states, and they're mostly states that have an initiative process. The exception to that is Michigan, which adopted an initiative in 2018 and was one of 5 states that adopted some type of ballot reform. So it was Michigan, Missouri, Ohio, yay, Colorado, and Utah. And what's interesting is that each one of those 5 states that adopted some type of redistricting reform in 2018 actually represents almost the whole spectrum of what we see. So Michigan on the one side with a very independent commission made up of citizens. Politicians are actually banned from being on the commission. People who are lobbyists are banned from being on the commission. People who are major donors are banned from being on the commission. All the way to a state like Utah, which kind of like Florida, they have some rules for what those lines need to be, the rules for drawing the lines. In many ways, actually, we've seen those types of reforms all the way from a super independent commission all the way to just constitutional rules for whatever the line drawing body is that they have to follow. Be very effective in reining in some of the worst kinds of partisan gerrymanders. Now, I'll say that Ohio, and for those of you who've been looking at this map, is marked in purple. I think appropriately so, because you all are a true purple state, and you've chosen a method that is sort of right in the middle of the road, right? There's a commission, but it tends to be a backup commission. For the congressional level, for the legislative level, it's the thing, right? But it's a commission that's made up of a mixture of legislators and also state elected. And there are 3 states that look a little bit like what Ohio has. So Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Arkansas. And so if you're interested in looking at this map in greater detail, we have it on our Common Cause website. Just Google Common Cause Redistricting, and you'll pull it up. Next slide. So Catherine asked me to compare what is Ohio like with kind of where are other states, and what do they do? And just because I happen to be from California, I'm going to use California as sort of a point of comparison. And some of the questions that came in from the emails and sort of online chats were asking about this question. So some people were asking, so just how diverse can an independent redistricting commission be? Obviously, it reflects the state's population. But in a state like California, we had a very diverse commission. As you can see from this picture, 14 people, 5 Democrats, 5 others, 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and 4 others. But then within that mix, a significant representation of Asian Americans, African Americans, and Latinos. We had a Native American and a Pacific Islander, people from different gender identities, and a good mix of men and women. So what's really exciting is that we were looking at geography, we were looking at ethnicity, we were looking at gender, and we really wanted to make sure that the state's diversity was represented as much as possible. We were also looking for people who would appreciate the diversity of the state. So just because you're a certain skin color doesn't mean that you're going to go around appreciating and listening to the testimony that's given. And ultimately, we wanted to create a process that would really value the input that people from around the state were giving. Now, how does that compare to Ohio? Next slide. Let's see if this is working. I sure hope it is. Next slide. Yay. Okay, it does work. Okay, so this is primarily the congressional process, but the commission composition is going to be largely the same for the legislative process, right? So at the congressional level, you all have created a commission, but it is a backup, right? So the first step is to see if the legislature can pass a map by a 3/5 vote. If they do, then hurrah, that means that they've managed to kind of talk amongst themselves, figure out what's fair, and adopt that map. If they don't, then this commission kicks in. And this commission at the congressional level anyways is made up of your governor, your auditor, your state secretary of state, and then 4 people who are chosen by the legislative leaders, right? And so the 4 people who are chosen by the legislative leaders means that you're going to have 2 people from the largest party and 2 people from the second largest party, right? In this case, Democrats and Republicans. Amongst the 3 statewide elected, that'll depend on who's elected and sitting in that office in 2021. So for the legislative process, similarly, you all have a 7-person panel, and instead of it being a backup commission, it's the thing that's actually creating those lines. Yeah, next slide. So in many states, regardless of whether they have a commission or no commission, a state demographer who's drawing the lines, or just rules, they do have a set of redistricting criteria. And here's where Ohio's process kind of compares to other states. Ohio, at the congressional level, what you all have is that the General Assembly has to pass a plan by 3/5 vote, as I mentioned. But if it doesn't, then the commission gets a bite at the apple. They have a chance to pass that plan by October 31st. And if that doesn't happen, then the General Assembly can pass a plan by a majority vote, but they have to follow these rules. And those rules include a line that says that the maps that the General Assembly shall not pass a plan that unduly favors or disfavors a political party or its incumbents. I want you all to hold on to that phrase, because that is a major innovation that we first saw in Florida, and now we've seen in multiple states that have actually copied what Ohio did, right? And so we see that phrase, we call that the anti-gerrymandering phrase, but we see that phrase in many state constitutions. California, we didn't have the benefit of this phrase when we were thinking about it, so you all are a step ahead of us on that one. And in a second, I'll tell you why that phrase is so important. So next slide. So at the legislative process. So the legislative process, they don't have to wait for a first vote of 3, whether or not the legislature can vote by 3/5 and then a commission. The commission just has to follow these legislative criteria. So there are the standard ones that talk about equal population, contiguity, compactness, and not splitting your county and your municipal and township boundaries. But as well, there are rules that require that if the state legislative map doesn't have support from both sides, and if it has more than 6 splits, okay, that's the first bullet point, or if it's judged to favor one party, or it doesn't correspond closely to the statewide political preferences of the voters of Ohio, then there's a chance to litigate and challenge those maps. Again, really significant, right? This prohibition on drawing lines to favor or disfavor one political party over others, that's built into the state constitution. And again, I'll get to exactly why that's your number one hook to be able to hold your legislature or your commission accountable to making sure that the lines that are drawn are fair. Next slide. Great. Okay, so last part of what I want to talk about is sort of how does the process, the public's access compare to what Ohio has created. So in California, we had a process that was created that said, when you draw draft maps, you have to show those maps and you have to have them kind of on public display for a period of time. And then you have to receive public comment for a period of time. And then as you are making any changes to those draft maps, all of those changes have to be available to the public for viewing. We actually had a process that turned out to be, because of the technology, something that was iterative. So after they displayed the draft maps in a static form for a period of time, then they went into hearings like this. And you can see this hearing room is packed. This was a hearing where I showed up 3 hours beforehand, and I thought it was going to be quiet and I could prepare my notes and I could just be ready to kind of talk. And it turned out that there was already a line lined up out the side of the building of people who are excited to come and talk to the commission. And at that meeting, they actually had a big screen. And so as people came up to talk, the mapper, the demographer, would take the information that somebody was talking about in terms of where they lived, where their community was. Please don't cut a line through this area or this neighborhood or this community, right? And they would capture that on the map. And we saw that process all the way through the end, so that as they took the draft map and they started moving lines, every time they moved a line, you could see it on a big screen, and eventually it became something that you could watch on the internet too. That's the kind of thing where, frankly, in Ohio, you all can push for, because you all have, next slide, really great open meeting laws and really great transparency laws. It's not built into the redistricting portion, but just generally speaking, your government is governed by Ohio Sunshine laws. And so it's just something that you should be keeping in mind in terms of things that you can expect and demand from your government. Now, the other thing is that you all have very strong Records Act. And that Records Act means that you can request any kinds of conversations or draft maps or things like that that go into the building of the final maps. In many ways, that horrible quote that comes from Thomas Hoffler comes out of discovery that we did in another case in North Carolina that I think some of the people who are listening right now asked about, Common Cause v. Lewis, where we, by just a stroke of luck, Thomas Hoffler, we had already deposed him, we had collected a lot of information, but over the fall, during the period that we were litigating, he passed away, and his daughter decided that she wanted to make available all of his files. And so she came across 18 floppy drives or flash drives and 4 hard drives, and decided that she was going to respond to a subpoena and turn everything over. It's kind of rare, because usually, you know, legislative defendants will fight tooth and nail to not share anything. But Thomas Hoffler's daughter decided that for the sake of transparency and openness and, you know, making sure that little d democracy was preserved, she shared all of those files. And that's how we started to find out those kind of comments that were made. But you also have the Open Records Act of Ohio that allows you to request those kind of documents and start to peel away at what the true meaning is. Now, the other piece is, and I should just mention, Jen mentioned that those documents, the Hoffler files, were critical in the citizenship case, the case that challenged the addition of the citizenship question to the census. And the reason why it ended up, we ended up succeeding in supporting groups like ACLU to challenge and take that question off of the census form is because Thomas Hoffler actually wrote and researched a memo that said he could help to give an advantage to Republicans and non-Hispanic whites, his words, not mine, that he could give an advantage to Republicans and non-Hispanic whites by adding a citizenship question and essentially eliminating a very large portion of people who are non-citizens or under the age of 18 from the redistricting process. So it was his way of adding another layer of manipulation to the redistricting process. We had seen already from those Hoppler files that there were schemes behind North Carolina, Ohio, Missouri, Texas, Virginia, the list goes on. And clearly being able to use things like Open Records Acts to really peel open what the deliberations are is critical. Now, how do you do that in Ohio? You've got your Open Records Act, and then additionally, that language that we just looked at that talks about how the lines that are drawn may not favor or disfavor a party or an incumbent. That language that we saw in Florida was used in League of Women Voters of Florida versus Detzner to peel open the Florida legislature's redistricting and find that there had been partisan gerrymandering, there had been manipulation, and the court ordered those lines to be redrawn. And ultimately, they adopted lines that were put forward by the coalition in Florida that includes League of Women Voters and Common Cause. So the exciting piece is that you all have the exact ingredients that you need to make sure that there's going to be great participation, that whoever's drawing the lines has to be responsive, and if they're not responsive, we can bring them to court. I think that's it, Catherine. I'll hand it back to you.
Well, this is the time that we move on to questions. And so what I'll do is I'll actually ask everybody to come so I can see y'all now. And so we'll start with some questions. So the first one is from Michael from Cleveland. He says, what do we do if we hate the proposed maps at the end? And how long will we have to oppose them? Now, I'm going to ask this to Jen, but before we go any further, I want you to give some examples, Jen, for like, what are the kinds of, when we say we hate the maps, sometimes, you know, there are different reasons to not like maps. What are the kinds of things that people might be looking for as problematic?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we're going to be, and I think Kathay would have great ideas, a better articulation of what we're looking for that's problematic. But I think we're certainly looking for those really goofy lines where communities are being split in ways that seem just problematic. One of the things we found recently as we were looking at the congressional maps actually during our trial, our litigation, is that a large portion of Ohioans actually are driving by a congressional district office that's not theirs to go get to their congressional. So they live closer to a congressional district office than their own congressperson. So that kind of representation, or that representational fairness, we're going to be wanting to analyze it to see, you know, if we look at different elections in the past where maybe Republicans didn't turn out as well, or Democrats didn't turn out as well, would those maps still basically perform the same way, which means we're going to really cement in kind of a partisan advantage. So I think those would be some of the things we're looking for. So the first thing we're going to do is, if we really, 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 really don't like the maps, we're just going to do everything we can to raise hell. And maybe I'm not supposed to cuss, but we are going to, you know, call our lawmakers. We're going to write letters to the editor. We're going to ask ed boards to talk about all the reasons why these maps are a problem. I don't know how long we're going to have, Michael Barron, because we may be changing our timeline potentially because of the census. It is true that this will move quickly. But then, as Kathay pointed out, there are, we do now have stronger legal hooks for state court. And so if we see that these maps are truly unfair and truly are partisan gerrymanders that really will pollute and weaken our democracy, then we have legal options there that would be explored.
Well, thank you.
I'll just add
ask this
on the time
it's from,
frame, there are some requirements
So I'm not sure whether it's me or you that's kind of frozen.
It's Kathy. So I think she was going to talk about that, and I didn't
We can
go
hear you,
into the
Catherine.
greater detail.
Okay.
Yes, Kathy is who we're supposed to hear. I think she's frozen.
Sorry,
Are you there
I was
now,
just going to
Kathy?
say on the time frame, there are some specific deadlines. Can you hear me? Is that me?
We can.
There are some specific timeframes that are built into the state constitution, but one of the things to know is that with redistricting, sadly, you hear about redistricting lawsuits that last all the way through the end of the decade. So, I mean, we were still suing North Carolina all the way up through 2018 and 19, right? And some of the states in Florida, you know, they were litigating for a very long time. So the reality is that if there's a problem, sometimes you need an election cycle or two to be able to really kind of bring a body of evidence before the court to show what the impact is. So there isn't particularly a statute of limitations on when you can bring a lawsuit other than being able to point to the state maps having an impact and then showing what those impacts are. Some of those things, like getting at what the intent of the legislature was to try to benefit or disfavor a party or an incumbent, it might take some time to do some discovery on, but other things like whether or not there's an impact in skewing the partisan vote so that a group of people don't have the ability to elect a candidate of their choice, you might need a few election cycles for.
All right, so Anne from Kent has, how do we make this process into a virtual game or brain teaser so that many people engage in it? Drawing fair, oh, sorry everybody, fair and appropriate maps that
if you want, I can take that.
congressional districts. Oh, I'm sorry everybody. Anyway,
I think we get it. I think
how can we get people involved?
Yeah, so we're gonna, Anne, I love it. We are going to get people involved. That's why we do the map contests. And again, that's why we're looking at 2 different programs. Last time you had to create the entire map and submit it. This time we also could be having where you just make your own district. And we think that will be a tool for classrooms, for churches, for Rotary clubs. Our vision is that lots of people would get involved with those map contests. Oh, and there are fun games.
Kitty from Columbus. This is one I'm actually going to hand to you, Kathy. It's what are the tech tools for map making? And I think this question is more about like, well, how can we get involved in map making? What are the kinds of things that are happening across the country so that citizens can participate in map making?
Mm-hmm. So the good news is that there are a lot of professors out there in the universe who've decided that they want to use their brains to tackle this question, right? Traditionally, there is a software maker, Esri, that has made this one piece of software, Maptitude, that's a mapping program that most legislatures use. It's fairly robust. You take all the state data in, and then it sort of gives you a lot of ways to measure what you're doing, and kind of as you move one precinct in or out of a district, it tells you kind of what the stats are for that district. But what's interesting is that, you know, a lot of the free software has now caught up. So I would say that there are 3 main projects that have created some kind of software. One is called MGGG, and it's software that is called Redistrictor with no ER, it's just R at the end. They're headed up by a Professor Moonduchin out of Tufts. It's really fantastic because it's pretty intuitive and it's easy to use. And hers should be, I think it's already available, you can Google it right now, but it should be also available for folks who are thinking about wanting to put in information about your community of interest, right? We're working with them to do that. Your neighborhood, you know, building both small and large things. So districts, whole districts, or small, like, I just want to tell you about my neighborhood, okay? Princeton Gerrymandering Project is doing something somewhat similar. And then the last one is Azavea and Professor Michael McDonald. Now, Azavea has created something that's like Maptitude. It has all the bells and whistles, but it also means that you've got to have the patience to kind of work through a lot of those interesting tools. So I think as you all figure out like what you want to do, whether that's creating bringing on some of that free software for a competition purpose, or encouraging people to create small snapshots of their neighborhood or their communities, or drawing whole districts across the state, that each one of those pieces of software are worth talking about. Maptitude has realized that there is competition out there, and so they're starting to provide lower cost nonprofit rates, which I'll work with anybody to kind of make sure that you can get access to. And then the last is that there are some games online, and thanks to Mia for pulling these up, redistrictinggame.org and gametheorytest.com. There's also some fun board games for everybody who's still locked in because of COVID, that you can kind of go online, just Google gerrymander game, and there literally are board games that you can kind of build your own gerrymander empire and learn the logic behind redistricting.
Well, thank you. So the next one is from Anne from Columbus, and this is, this is one that's about public engagement. And this is, I'm going to send this off to you, Jen. How do we guarantee that the Ohio State or the state legislative and congressional districts in 2021, that process is actually transparent?
Yeah, so first, I think it's a great question. I'm not sure we can ever guarantee anything, but let's keep in mind that the two ballot initiatives that we won on finally in 2015 and 2018 were negotiations with the General Assembly, right? And it was because the General Assembly was hearing so much from voters about why they wanted fair maps and that they wanted the end of gerrymandering, that it's going to take that same deep and strong, persistent and consistent push for fairness and transparency. And I think that starts today as we're asking folks running for office their stance on gerrymandering and transparency in government. If you go to a virtual town hall, I guess we don't really go in person, but if you're attending a virtual town hall or something with a candidate in your area, I think it starts by when you are visiting with your legislator or sending a note to your legislators today about why you care for fair maps. And then continuing to be part of this process, as Fair Districts, Common Cause League, as we continue to send out action items, as we will ramp up through the end of this year and into next year, that you're taking those actions, that when we are sending you an email and saying we need you to call today, that you do that. When we are saying we need letters to the editor or we need someone from a certain community to visit with a lawmaker, that you are a part of that, because the truth is that Jen and Catherine are not very magical, right? We can only do so much. We're only as strong as our team, and you are our team for holding the legislature accountable.
Well, thank you. So this has got to be for Kathy. This one, can we objectively look at independent redistricting commissions and determine if they draw maps that are more fair than those states that use sitting legislative members and executive branch members to draw the maps?
Yeah. Well, okay. So I'm just going to use the analogy of cooking, since a lot of us, have been locked in, and we found ourselves going to recipe books and doing a lot of experimentation with things that you never thought you were going to start cooking, like flan or bread. And you're going to find a lot of recipes out there, right? And you might have some that are measuring your sugar based on metric, and others that are measuring your sugar based on cups and teaspoons. And each one of those measurements is totally valid. And in a lot of ways, deciding how much sugar or butter you want to put into your cake mix is also going to depend on what you are trying to value. Do you have a sweet tooth, or are you diabetic, right? And which of those things are you trying to balance out, right? So there's not a perfect recipe necessarily. And what I would say is what's fair depends on kind of balancing a lot of different factors. So you're not just balancing your sugar, but also your flour and your butter and, all those other yummy things. In redistricting, then you're balancing you know, the extent to which you want to be sure that you're protecting minority communities under the Voting Rights Act, but you're also looking at whether or not counties, townships, or cities have been put into little pieces. You're also wanting to take the testimony and listen to people talk about their neighborhoods and their communities, right, that may transcend race, or they may be the equivalent of race. And then additionally, you're looking at partisan factors, right? What's fair? And in all those different things, is it contiguous? Is it compact? You know, are all of the other factors, you're going to have some judgment calls. We have in several of those pieces of litigation, we brought in Joey Chen, who developed an algorithm that said, okay, here's what you said in your Constitution that you want. And sometimes it was 5 factors, sometimes it was 10 factors, right? And the computer would say, great, and it would generate not one map that satisfied all those factors, but thousands. And frankly, it could have generated 1 million maps that would satisfy those factors, just depended on like sort of when you told it to stop. What they can do is they can tell you patterns. They can sort of say, generally speaking, after I've generated 2,000 of those maps, you can see that there's clustering, and you would not see a skew the way you saw in Ohio, where if the voter electorate was 50-50, that you'd end up with 25% for Democrats and 75% for Republicans. But what it won't tell you is what's that perfect mix, right? So it'll tell you like that's an abnormality, but it won't tell you kind of how much is in the middle that feels right to you. That's a decision that ultimately has to be made by a group of decision makers. And in Ohio, you all have decided that that's going to be either your General Assembly or your commission. There are ways of measuring. And what will happen is that we'll put a lot of those measures together. Sometimes they all point to that map, that's bad across many different measures. And then sometimes it'll be a battle of the experts. I'm going to go ahead and just answer the next question. Are independent redistricting commissions able to attract members who reflect the diversity of the community that they represent? And the answer is a resounding yes. We just got through the second round of whittling down thousands of people who applied to the California Commission. And once again, we've got a very diverse population of finalists. And I'm really excited because they kind of come from all parts of the state. They represent, you know, the diversity of our state's ethnicity, gender, you know, and other viewpoints. I think the biggest challenge is always just that it is true that people who have the time to give are also going to be people who have either the ability to carve out this time from their kind of job, which means they're either independent business owners or else they're professors or they're students. They do tend to fall into more of a white collar, right, category. But other than that, they really represent the breadth and diversity of the state.
Thank you. Well, you're actually on a roll, so I'm going to bother you about this one too, because I know that you were involved in Redistricting Common Cause. Michael, I know you're being super patient, so I'm going to bother you about it. But let's start with this, Kathy. What are the options now, if any, to contest redistricting methods or results in federal court?
Right. So the quick story is, in federal court, there actually are a lot of ways to challenge a map. Okay. We still have the ability to challenge a map because the districts are not equal population. We still have the ability to challenge a map under the Voting Rights Act, right? Because a minority population has been disenfranchised and they don't have the ability to elect a candidate of their choice. There are a number of ways to challenge in federal court. What we don't have the ability to challenge in federal court is challenging them based on a partisan gerrymander, okay? And that's what Rucho versus Common Cause, and before that, Gilby versus Whitford were trying to challenge. And in Maryland, so we had a blue state too, Benesec v. Lamone. The court basically said, the math is really hard, and we don't know that it's really the role of the federal courts to be able to do this. Now, what they did say, good news, the Supreme Court said, this may still be something for the states to do. So that could be in state courts challenging, it could be changing state constitutions, or it could be using the state initiative process to amend your redistricting process. So I see that the next question is from Sherry and Gus, and it's asking about whether or not Ohio Constitution should be updated to include a free and fair elections clause. And in fact, actually in 2 different states, North Carolina and Pennsylvania, we actually did sue, and League of Women Voters led the Pennsylvania case along with Pennsylvania Public Interest Legal Foundation. And then we led the case in North Carolina. And League also was, involved. And what we were able to establish was that when your state constitution has a free elections clause, that you can actually use that to unwind partisan gerrymanders. Now, the exciting thing about free elections clauses is that they can also be used to challenge voter suppression laws, right? So this is actually a law that says, that people in your state are entitled to a free and fair election. So to the question of whether or not you should, I think that some of your leaders, Kathay, Turcer, and Jen Miller, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but I think you already are quite excited about the idea about a next step, really bringing a free and fair elections clause to Ohio and trying to put that in the Constitution.
So Michael, do you want to jump in and on either case? Actually, this is the specific question. What exactly is a free elections clause?
Can you go to the next slide while Michael is talking? And then yeah. Okay. Oh, no, sorry. I thought the map was in there. All right, go back.
Sorry.
Okay. So what was your question?
So my question, we had a whole conversation about a free elections clause. And then I was like, well, it's very possible we don't actually know what that actually is. And so it would be useful from a legal scholar to give us some an answer on that and to give us a little guidance here in Ohio.
Yeah. So well, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court didn't know what it meant either until it ruled on these cases. So this is something that hasn't been really used. Like almost all litigation around redistricting has been in federal court because over the last 50 years we've been taught as lawyers that the federal Constitution is the root of all protections and freedoms, it was and yet there is this like really robust state constitutional tradition that we've ignored. State constitutions oftentimes have been amended a lot more than the federal Constitution has. They oftentimes are very progressive. They're amended typically like in progressive, the progressive era, like in the post New Deal and the 1970s. So they're oftentimes very progressive, and yet they have all this language that we tended to ignore. But if you sort of take the principles there, the cases that interpret it, people have found that the state constitutions also have something to say about entrenchment of political parties or favoring yourself or others. And so and the state courts are very willing to go out on a limb when the federal courts weren't, right? And in fact, like the only people right now who have found policing partisan gerrymandering hard at all are 5 of the justices on the Supreme Court. Like, state, lower federal courts, state courts have all found it like, hey, we can manage this. We know how to deal with it. And it's just, something that is good. But so I would, even if you don't have a free and fair elections clause in Ohio, I'd encourage you to like look at the Ohio Constitution, because I bet there's other stuff in there that you didn't even know that would be worth taking up, because the reality is this is going to be a hard redistricting cycle. There's a lot of incentive still to gerrymander. A lot rides on it, and you're going to need all the tools that you can have. So
it's interesting because the next question is really about, is there a way for the public to object about maps that are drawn to favor or disfavor? And of course, the new amendments make an enormous difference. This could also be, is there a way for us to object if, for example, Franklin County is split up into 14 different pieces, or communities are divided a lot? And on that, I am going to throw that to Jen Miller.
Oh, I'm sorry, I was reading the questions and answers.
Well, it's good to read the questions. That's why we have them up here too.
But so I didn't actually hear yours because I was reading the questions and answers.
So what I wanted to highlight was that that the maps could be drawn to favor or disfavor an incumbent,
Oh, great. Yeah.
We could also have political subdivisions that we don't actually like.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's true. I think the incumbent issue, and I did see questions on incumbents. I think that that one is so interesting because that was part of the justification for this decade worth of maps. It was the justification for the gerrymandering, this idea that they were trying to preserve incumbents, but they actually paired more incumbents to run off than they needed to, which seems like they weren't really, they were trying to protect incumbents necessarily. And then we certainly saw, I think with the snake on the lake, right, that we ended up having to, first off, trying to combine Toledo and Cleveland, very different economies, very different populations, very different needs, with a small strip of rural Ohio in between, also running to incumbents off. So I do think that you know, Dennis Kucinich against Chapter. So I do think that that's an interesting question. There is value in having, saving your incumbents, right? If you think about it, both Republicans and Democrats, your incumbents are gonna have for your state a better understanding just as to how Congress works and what their job is, or how to navigate the state house and what the different processes are. It's just not it's not the number one priority, right? The number one priority needs to be representational fairness. The number one priority needs to be thinking about that compactness and what those districts really look like in that regard. So hopefully that helps.
Ooh, this one, I bet you know this is coming for you, Michael. If 2020 census results are contested, for instance, due to dramatic potential urban undercounts, how might that play out?
So that is a big uncertainty because the census is this brand new, you know, the census was already going to be hard. As most of you know, it was online for the first time. That's brand new. There was all the threat of the citizenship question, which scared a lot of communities, which are historically undercounted, immigrant communities and communities of color. And now we have the disruption of the delay with lots of people moving around, or, you know, students being away from school. I mean, just a ton of delay. And so, you know, so far overall, the numbers are coming in okay. So far, the 60% of households nationwide have responded. Ohio is better at almost 65.4%, a little bit lower in some of the big counties, but, you know, Ohio is coming in good. Overall, 69% of households self-responded in Ohio in 2010. And so, you know, Ohio is getting close to where it was, and then there'll be a round of door knocking. But you're right. It is possible that there could be significant undercounts, especially in some of the communities that are historically undercounted. And I think that, you know, people are looking very closely at, you know, what options there might be. You know, the reality is that you're probably not going to get a census redo, but there might be ways to sort of argue that, you know, states, when they draw maps, should adjust the data separately, you know, and, you know, because it's not required in every state that you use the census data. So there might be other ways to do that. And, you know, so, you know, there are a lot of concerns that, you know, many communities, particularly communities of color, are being undercounted. And likewise, some people are apparently being overcounted, right? Because, like, you know, people may have filled out the census in New York when they, you know, first got the form back earlier in the year, and then they fled to their vacation house, and they filled it out there online too. And so, you know, you know, there's potentially an overcount. The one thing that we do know is that while there are some communities that are always overcounted, there are also communities that are overcounted, and those are like white people, right? Because white people like filling out forms, and so white people will, you know, oftentimes fill out forms. And so, you know, there's a lot to be worked out, and, you know, this is brand new territory. So that is a possibility to watch for litigation around the census, which potentially could further delay redistricting. So.
All right, so now we have a question about prison gerrymandering. This person is in the know. So this is, I'm going to throw this to you, Jen. Do any of the new Ohio redistricting procedures reduce prison gerrymandering?
So I don't know if everyone knows what prison gerrymandering is, but that is the concept that you can that map makers could take the population of the folks in prison, and thinking prison federal, so may not be mostly individuals who are not going to be voting at that time because they're serving felony sentences. So grabbing a lot of population for their equal population, but they're not really the voting population. And also, when these individuals are finally done with their sentence and are re-entering society, they may not even be from that area. So it's not really a very accurate situation. And so that is a concern, and that will be something that we are watching out for. But to be honest, I don't know the best practices for defending that. And I'm wondering if Kathay wanted to jump in a little bit.
Sure. So states like California, Maryland, a number of states have adopted rules where the prison population, we actually look at the records and find out where their last known address was. And for purposes of redistricting, we just assign that population back to their last known address. And it's a matter of record keeping because your courts have that information, Department of Probation has that information. And it's very likely that when somebody is released from prison, that's exactly where they're going to go back to. And so you want to make sure that those communities have the resources to be able to receive folks and be able to provide, you know, all the kinds of services or assistance that community needs. It also helps with making sure that there's not recidivism and, you know, people ultimately, you know, don't get into the prison-based pipeline. So we're going to see a number of states in 2021 start to reassign populations back to the last known address.
So, and you know, one of the things that's really clear to me with prison gerrymandering, we actually still have work to do. I feel like we've been on this long redistricting reforms, you know, long hike. And you know, now we're going to go through this implementation process, but we really do need to address prison gerrymandering, and we do need to think about that free election clause. We just need to keep, you know, an eye on what are the kinds of things and ways that we can actually improve democracy. So I just kind of eyeballed the next question, which kind of made me giggle. Because we all have stories about this. So this is the question. If Ohio loses a congressional seat due to the 2020 census, we're likely to, by the way, how will they determine which district is eliminated? Now, one of the things that we know from the past, you know, I'm just answering this myself, people. One of the things that we know from the past is that map makers often have changed districts around for fairly petty reasons. And a good example would be, there was a guy named Vern Rife. You might all be familiar with him. I don't know if you've visited the Rife Tower, but he was a speaker and he really didn't like a guy named Bob Szymanski. He disliked him so much, keeping in mind he was a Democrat. So both were Democrats. He disliked him so much that he actually made his district, his congressional district, Bob's congressional district, really not the best district. He made it much more Republican. He just changed it so it was a very odd shape. And interestingly enough, Bob lost his race. Now, when Bob lost his race, guess who came in? A young up-and-comer, a guy named John Kasich. And so all these kinds of shenanigans in 1981 were the kinds of things that fostered, you know, a long career for John Kasich. And I think we can all think about, you know, we talked about the snake on the lake. We can all think about, you know, folks that were just not really in love with Dennis Kucinich and were ready to kind of move him out, and putting him and Marcy Kaptur together in the same district. It also had the benefit of getting rid of a Democrat, you know, or in a Democratic district. So there, you know, there are partisan reasons for how these kinds of things can be made. There can be petty reasons, and hopefully with our new rules, we will actually have a better process because it is likely that we will lose a district. Ohio population has stayed fairly constant rather than gone up. And that generally means that we will lose one. Does anybody have something else they wanted to add? not usually the moderator who takes over the question. Go for it,
Well,
Jen.
you did. That was a great story. I just wanted to point out that the person who asked this question is Andre Washington of the A. Philip Randolph Institute, good friend of the League and Common Cause. And the second part of his question was, will it be decided in a bunker somewhere, which is also funny. And so I just want to remind everyone, and maybe some of you don't know, but I think a lot of you will, that the map was initially created in a bunker, which was a hotel room in downtown Columbus. And so the point of the matter is that we are really hopeful that the transparency will be stronger because of the ballot initiatives. But in addition, Kathay has given us some really great suggestions in terms of how to use existing law. And we'll be doing that. And just wanted to say hey to Andre Washington.
Yeah.
Well, absolutely. We have a few questions, and then I thought we would wrap up. One of the things that I thought that was interesting that we got kind of repeatedly had to do with a concern about, because one political party has been in power for a really long time in the state of Ohio. When we've talked about fair maps, it can really sound like what we're saying is that we want more democratic maps. And so we got a number of questions about, like, do we just want more democratic or democratic leaning districts, or do we want to have fair districts, and what is it we're actually looking for? And so I'm actually going to ask Jen about that. I'm interested in what Kathay thinks, and I'm also interested to hear from you too, Michael, about, like, well, what are the kinds of, when you think about a good district, what are you looking for?
So I don't feel like I need to take too much time, but I'm just going to reiterate that the League has been fighting gerrymandering since the apportionment board was created in '67. And we were trying to end our gerrymandering tradition very early on, when actually Democrats held the pen and were the gerrymanderers, because it's an equal opportunity game. Yeah. And so I just want to say that for us, it really is about the voters, and it really is about having maps that are fair and representational. And I'm going to let the experts kind of speak further. The one thing I will also say is that we've also always wanted an independent commission like California's. And what we learned the hard way is that we were just not getting it. And so we decided to go with these reforms that we have that are not perfect. They're certainly a lot better. We have decades of gerrymandering under our belt in Ohio, and so we're hopeful that we can really use these to kind of grow a standard of fairness in Ohio, but we'll need all of your help. And I'll hand it over to the experts now.
Yeah. So, Jen, I'm going to absolutely agree with you that in state after state, when it's a state like California or Maryland or Illinois, where the redistricting has been carried out by Democrats and they have gerrymandered because they have the power of the pen, and so why not? Our organizations have stood to sort of challenge them. And League was one of the few organizations that stood with Common Cause in California to challenge the Democratic majority, including Nancy Pelosi, who at the time was the Speaker of the House, to say that we wanted that commission. And it was hard. It was hard because, a lot of our Democratic friends were like, what are you doing? We have control. Why would you do that, right? But fair's fair, right? And so in other states like North Carolina, Ohio, where the process recently has been controlled by Republicans, and the most egregious examples of redistricting, maybe because Thomas Hoppler was just a mad genius, right? And he had money behind him, but they were very successful. And I should just mention, if folks have not read David Daley's book, Rat Effed, you should go get a copy, because it sort of talks exactly about sort of that systematic approach throughout the country, state by state, to try to gerrymander the states according to a formulaic approach. What I'll say is, what are we looking for in Ohio? The question was, are you looking for competitive districts or just Democratic districts? And I'd say it's actually neither. There are going to be some places where you just have a lot of Democrats living, and some places where you just have a lot of Republicans living. And you're not trying to force a competitive seat where you don't actually have populations that are intermingled. You're not trying to kind of create, in California, that would mean that we'd have to create kind of spaghetti districts that kind of stretch from the coast where Democrats live to, you know, the inland area where Republicans live. That's not our goal. We're not trying to gerrymander that way. We are trying to put together communities that make sense, neighborhoods that make sense, townships and cities that make sense, right? And when you get that, then some places will be heavily Democratic, some places will be heavily Republican, and some places will be mixed. You will end up with more seats that are competitive because you're not putting a finger on the scale to benefit one party or another, and you're not trying to put a finger on the scale to benefit a particular incumbent by putting their house in the middle of the district and then excising all of their challengers. But at the same time, that's not sort of the overriding goal. The other thing that we're not trying to put a finger on is to favor one party versus another. At least that's for Common Cause and League. I'll just say, fundamentally, that is not what our organizations are about. If the state of Ohio has people who are inclined to vote with one party, and that map allows them to change their minds, you know, because they're just so angry at whatever the president is doing or whatever the legislature is doing or whatever the state legislature is doing, that ability to make that district to be responsive to what people want, that's the key thing. And in California, because of the commission, we ended up with seats that flipped between party control. And depending on how people were feeling about the responsiveness or the ability of their government to represent them, they flipped control. And that's a really powerful feeling because what it does is it tells people when you come out to vote, it matters. There is actually a choice on the ballot. And if you organize hard enough, you can actually make a difference in changing control or changing an incumbent. That for us is the critical piece because it increases voter participation and it ultimately means that the electorate is representative of a much larger swath of Ohioans, and also the policy choices that your state assembly are making really reflect all Ohioans and not just that small sliver that sort of came out to vote because they weren't so jaded or they felt like they were going to get their way. That's really important.
So Michael, did you have something you wanted to add?
I've forgot the question now.
Well, I'll give you a new question.
Are you just doing this to help Democrats? That's the question.
Okay.
No, I can give you a new one if you want.
No, I'll say that, and you can give me a new one. But I totally agree with Kathy. Like, I live in Brooklyn, New York, where, Barack Obama got 98% of the vote in my state assembly district. You couldn't draw a Republican district here if your life depended on it.
You can't find them.
You can't find them, and like in West Texas, you can't draw a Democratic district. And so, what we've always emphasized is like you shouldn't be outcome determinative. Like that's just you should have a fair process where people's preferences based on the rules that are there about keeping communities together and so on are respected. And you get my favorite example is the story of the fire district in California, right, where like people wanted to be kept together because they had a common concern about wildfires, and they said like it's really important that people in Sacramento hear our concerns, and nobody's paying attention because we're just a small part of our community's divided, and we're just a small part of other districts, and they put it together, and like people actually, the people who represent the district care a lot about wildfires, right? And so, that's an example of a community of interest that no one would have thought of, but that actually like is something that matters a lot to people. And similarly, people might say like our school district's really important, or whatever, and people. The reality is like you could never meet everybody's community definitions, right? So you're going to have to choose, but the best choosing is when the commission is or the legislature is informed by public input, right? And so that's what you should want, and and that will produce a map, as we know, that is also politically fair, right? I mean, it just will happen, right? So
So this is the very last question. So I'm going to give it to all of you. So the worry that this person had was that we built into our Ohio Constitution that we want Democrats and Republicans to work together, or the major party and the minor party is the way they're described in the Ohio Constitution. Are we concerned about sweetheart deals?
Yes, I think in general, but not probably this cycle, right? Because Ohio has really gerrymandered maps. And that, I think Republicans to do that would have to say, okay, we're going to sacrifice like a whole bunch of our incumbents in order to do this sweetheart deal, because Democrats wouldn't take a sweetheart, like if they just said, let's keep this map as it is, like Democrats would say, no way, you've got an unfair advantage. And on the other hand, Republicans would have to say, okay, we're going to sacrifice this many Congress people, we're going to sacrifice 4 Congress people, and we're going to sacrifice, this many members of the General Assembly. And I don't think that's going to happen, but in the future, yeah, I mean, that's something that you want to watch against.
Yeah. In California, when in 2008, we finally did pass the first initiative that created a Citizens Commission, we had experienced about a decade of district lines that were created as a sweetheart deal between Democrats and Republicans. So to explain what that means, it means that in a weird, crazy way, the Democrats decided we're not going to beat the Republicans up. What we're going to do is make sure that every incumbent gets a seat of their choice, Democrat and Republican. That way we'll get an overwhelming supermajority to vote for it, and I scratch your back, you scratch mine. They did that, and then what happened was that our legislature became extreme. It sort of went, everybody got what they wanted, but what they did was they cherry-picked Democrats and Republicans. So Democrats became far more sort of on the left and Republicans far more on the right, and they only had to talk to their base. And the real battle became a battle at the primary level, not at the general level. And what ended up happening was that our legislature had a gridlock on the budget for about 4 or 5 budget seasons running. And it pissed people off so much that they said, you know what, let's do something next level. Let's create an independent redistricting commission. So maybe secretly you want to hope for a sweetheart deal so that next time you can kind of bring it to them and say, you like this, but let's go one level up and let's create that citizens redistricting commission that we all wanted. So I'm going to just say, like, it might happen, it might not happen, but use that as an opportunity to get what you really want.
And on that note, I'd like to highlight, we have so much more work to do together so that in fact, we can improve democracy here in Ohio and help to create a more robust America. I wanted to thank everybody who participated in this conversation. I also wanted to highlight there were some questions that we did not get to addressing. And what I'll do is I'm gonna go through those. I'll answer them the best that I can. We will put them online and we'll also send them out to you. For those of you who are like, wait a second, I missed this thing, I want a recording of this, we will be sending you a recording after we wrap up. And I just, wanted to say thank you to our, our esteemed panelists, just such, accomplished people who know so much about redistricting reform. We're very blessed that you were able to join us today. All right, thank you, everybody.
Thanks to the hundreds of people who signed on and care about redistricting in Ohio. Yay for you.
Thank you, redistricting reformers.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
All right, I think that's